So in order to understand semantic web technology, it helps to remind ourselves on what the traditional World Wide Web is and how it works. And for that, I need the slide. So give me a second. No, yes, this is the slide I need. Thank you. So in the World Wide Web, what happens is that we have documents, and the web is all about documents. And the documents are linked together, and you all know that those are these friendly blue things in, for example, Wikipedia pages. So here we see two documents. One is about omeprazole, and the other is about proton pump inhibitor. And we see that the documents are linked together. So there is a link from the document omeprazole to the document proton pump inhibitor. It's really important to remember that the link is completely anonymous. It is not meant to represent in any way the relationship that exists between omeprazole and the proton pump inhibitor. And it's easy to see that because you can imagine that the real-world relationship between omeprazole and the World Health Organization is completely different from the real-world relationship between omeprazole and proton pump inhibitor. So those links carry no semantic meaning. They are not meant to represent how these things are related. Now, the same people who came up with the idea of the World Wide Web, or who used it, who were really instrumental to its early development, at some point thought, well, maybe we should think about these things differently, and instead of making the web about documents, we should make the web a web that is about the things that these documents are about. So we don't have a document, we have a representation of omeprazole, and then we have a representation of proton pump inhibitor. And then we also represent the relationship between those entities in reality with different types of relationships that allows us to capture the difference in how things are related to each other in the real world. So we see that here in a small example where we say that omeprazole is a chemical substance and omeprazole inhibits hydrogen potassium ATP. So this is the most basic building blocks of the semantic web. They're called triples. They consist of subject, predicate, and object. In our case, the subject is omeprazole, the predicate is inhibits, and the object is hydrogen potassium ATP. Triples are very, in some sense, intuitive building blocks because they resonate with a syntactical structure that we find in many languages, including English. So people who know English should have no problem in getting this structure of subject, predicate, and object. So when the triples are, all of this, what we talked about now, is specified in a W3C. The W3C are the people who run the World Wide Web. It's the World Wide Web community. W3C stands for World Wide Web Community. And this is called RDF, the Resource Description Framework. It is a standard model to exchange data, and it was meant to be used to help data merging. And importantly, it uses unique resource identifiers to identify that both the entities, omeprazole and proton pump inhibitor, and the relationship, inhibits, ISA, and so on. And the unique identifiers are really important because when I heard about triple technology first, it was like, well, subject, predicate, object, that's really fairly limited, right? Because it's only 3 elements. The trick are the unique identifiers. So here you see at least halfway abbreviated the unique identifiers, which may look as unique resource locators look on the internet. So here we have a statement that omeprazole hydrogen potassium ATP. And we have a second triple saying that hydrogen unique identifier, what we can do is we can merge these two triples together. That creates a graph, in this case, one with 3 nodes and 2 edges. And we can do that ad infinitum. We can add more and more and more and more statements about either omeprazole or hydrogen potassium ATPase or proton pump until we get an endless graph. So this is the real strength about RDF. We can build a complex graph out of a really simple structure, namely the RDF triple. Another cool thing about the unique identifiers is that some people build them in a way that they are unique resource locators. The difference is clear, right? Unique resource identifiers versus unique resource locators. Okay, it's not. Thanks. So unique resource identifiers just identify a resource. They do not necessarily resolve in a browser. A unique resource locator locates a page on the internet in a browser. All unique resource locators are unique resource identifiers, but not all unique resource identifiers are unique resource locators. Yes, that is true. Good. So the cool people built their unique resource identifiers that they are unique resource locators, which means that if you enter the unique resource identifier of omeprazole in your browser and run it, or just enter, you'll get to a web page that explains more about omeprazole. Okay, so what we're dealing with here is graph data. Now, this of course means that query languages that we use so far will not be usable in our data any longer, because it's not that we want to address a table or a tabular structure or anything. We need to pull parts of our graph, and it's really important that we can pull from any end. So the direction of the relationships is no longer important. We can pull from any end in our graph, any path from path that we need. So there is a specific query language for that, which is called Sparkle. Sparkle is a recursive acronym which stands for Sparkle Protocol in RDF Query Language. It's recursive because Sparkle is also part of the name. Think about that if you like. It's a little bit special. That's also a W3C standard. This is the query language for RDF triples. And if you really get gung-ho into this whole semantic web business, and then you probably, hopefully, take my course in semantic web technology in a year, and then you will learn about Sparkle and how to do it. So the next big important aspect of the semantic web is the use of automatic inference. And we will talk a little bit about automatic inference and formal logic in a second. But first, we need to understand how it works. So imagine that we have a system in which our computer knows the triples that we see on the top half of this slide. So the computer knows that omeprazole is a chemical substance. Omeprazole inhibits hydrogen potassium ATPase. Hydrogen potassium ATPase is a proton pump. We still haven't done anything with a proton pump inhibitor. Now, what we can do is we can put a logical axiom on this graph, on the representation of a proton pump inhibitor, that specifies that anything that is a chemical substance and that inhibits a proton pump is a proton pump inhibitor. Now you'll say, but Matthias, this is really trivial. Everyone knows that, and actually it's also in the name of proton pump inhibitor. We know that because we are competent speakers of the language, but the computer doesn't know. The computer needs to learn that. So we'll add this axiom to teach the computer that what a proton pump inhibitor is. And now the amazing thing is when you run an inference machine, a so-called reasoner over it, the computer will automatically understand that omeprazole is a proton pump inhibitor. And it will do that every time that you enter a new chemical substance that inhibits anything that is a proton pump. So this is a really important and very, very strong feature of semantic web technologies. So how can you use that to your advantage? We had a small problem with drug-drug interaction evidence data. So the way that you all know that there exist drug-drug interaction compendia. Those are used for clinical decision support to help people not prescribe drugs which you don't want to describe if you want your patient to live or to have a good life. The way those are done is there are human curators. What they need to do, so basically they read through documents, for example, journal papers, but they also read through like micro publications on the internet about drug-drug interactions. Obviously, this information can come from very different sources. It can come from a clinical study, it can come from a case report, and it can also come from some in vitro experiment and basically point to a potential drug-drug interaction. So, and there are more. Quick question: if you have evidence from a case report that there is no interaction, then you have evidence from a clinical trial that there is an interaction. Which one would you pick? Yes, why? Exactly. I repeat it so that everyone gets it. The answer was clinical trial. The reason was that the case report is just an individual instance of something happening. Basically, what a case report is, you have a clinical researcher who needs to publish something. They look for something that looks like a little bit out of the ordinary, and then you write it up. That's the case report. Not, you know. You got the idea. Okay, so what we did then is we said, well, right now, this is the list of all of the different evidence types, and this is not only this is not even comprehensive. The list goes on. I think it's around about 30-something different evidence types, and there are humans who need to sort evidence into that. We thought that probably a computer can do that better, because my hunch is mostly a computer can do it better. So what we did then is we wrote axiomatic definitions like we did before for proton pump inhibitor for all of those evidence types. We loaded data. Oh, I think that is a question. Is that a question? How do I get the people to? Oh, they don't speak, right? They just write. Well, that's easy. Oh, you can't see my screen.
Okay. Let's see if the slide application share mode has turned itself off. That means it's turning itself on. Can you guys see now? Okay. All right, awesome. Thanks. Thanks for letting us know, everybody.
Yeah, thank you. Okay. I'll try my best. Okay, so I'm just assuming you hear me better now. This is as close as I can hold the phone to my mouth. Ooh. Good. Okay. So okay. So here we go. Yes, there we go. And then we just loaded the data, and then we run the reasoner, and that actually worked. So you can read up on that. We did a small test case that is already published, and we just presented the test case at MedInfo. That should come out soon. I mean, for reading. And if you need that before, you can just send me an email. So this is, yes. Uh-huh. Yes. The weighing actually, this is the outcome of a huge NIH-funded study, and we built two different systems. One is the evidence system, which does the weighing, and I have no part in that, and the other is the knowledge base, which is ontology-driven. So in the knowledge base, we don't do the weighing. The weighing is done in the evidence system. Good question, though. Okay, so this is how the interface of this looks. And all we did is we asked the curators the 6 questions that you can see in the center of the screen on the right-hand side. And those questions were sufficient to sort all of the data. So instead of now choosing one of 30-something classes, they just answer 6, I find, fairly simple questions, and we do the sorting for them. So this is exactly how you can use the definitions or the axioms in an ontology to help you manage your data, categorizing entities. This is an example from the small use case. You see we only had one evidence item. So there we had a really small number of correct positives and false positives. This is the axiom, and you see how the sorting actually worked. We actually did that in Protégé, which is not how you would do things, but we'll get to that later. Okay, so the evidence item is categorized automatically and correctly. Good job. Yeah, this is, for those interested, this is the information about the ontology we used for that. It's an open source ontology. You can look at it, you can use it, you can even change it. It was funded by the NLM. It's a large project. Okay, and there are publications about it. Okay, so now I gave you an example of how an ontology works and what an ontology is good for. You probably still ask yourself, what is an ontology? In order to explain that, I usually tell a small fairy tale that I borrowed from the late Terry Pratchett from his book, The Wintersmith. So in this book, there is a young witch, and the young witch has a huge conflict with a magical creature. And because of that, she went home to her parents' house to, ponder her options and make up her mind, what young witches do, and hopefully everyone else too. And one night she was scrubbing the kitchen floor, and her mother came down and said, "Wait, why are you scrubbing the kitchen floor? Are you not supposed to do that by magic?" And the young witch said, No. The last witch who scrubbed the kitchen floor using magic lost the floor, 2 pairs of slippers, and nearly a toe, because magic didn't know what was the dirt and what was the floor. This is exactly how most of our data management works. The computer does not understand what a diagnosis is. The computer does not understand what your diagnosis codes mean, because you don't tell the computer that. All these nifty definitions written in letters, they're just a string to the computer. All of the wisdom expressed in human language is lost on the computer completely. For the computer to understand a definition, you need to write that definition in a computer parsable language, in a language that the computer can take apart and use in some of its operations. And ontologies is one way to do that. Ontologies ought to be built in a computer parsable language. The definition of an ontology is a representation of reality. So an ontology is a representational artifact. It is meant to represent something in the world. For example, diseases, or cures for cancer, administration of your hospital or an informed consent process. In representing reality, it represents the entities and their interrelations in a specified domain of interest. The second half is more dictated by common sense than anything else. It's obvious that you could potentially build an ontology of the entire world, the universe. But it's not feasible, so don't do that. Whenever you build an ontology, pick a domain, define your domain carefully, and then go ahead and build that representation. And I said that before, but I really need to drive home that point. If it is not written in a machine interpretable language, it ain't an ontology. So if there are no definitions that our computer can understand, it cannot do the work of an ontology. This is, on this slide, you can see elements. Was there a ping? This system really keeps you on your toes, man. Okay, so this slide shows you features of ontologies. So we already talked about the unique identifiers. Really, the coolest thing under the sun needs to have unique identifiers. These unique identifiers not only identify individuals like you, me, the chair, and John Doe. They also identify classes of things: patients, doctors, hospitals, therapeutic options, informed consent documents. And they also identify relationships between things like inhibits, ISA, and so on. And then we have our class hierarchy. Each ontology has a hierarchy that is basically a tree. So you always have a root node that is built into the language with which we work here. And then we have the axioms. We talked about those. Those are the things that the computer can actually break down into operational steps, for example, when using a reasoner. That's all that we really need to make a computer happy. But the problem is that still we're in a situation where all of these things, ontologies, computers, information systems, are handled by meek human minds. So we need to have a textual definition that's understandable to humans, and we need to have a human readable label. And that's it. Those are the things that ontologies should have and that should be there. And when it comes to, yes. OWL. We'll get to that in a second. Like Sparkle, there's a particular language to write that. There are more. If you look up ontology languages on the web, there's not only OWL, there's also SCOAS, which doesn't allow all of the reasoning OWL does. OWL is logically the richest one, but there are multiple options. But that's a really good question. So, for example, I walked out at a presentation at AMIA last year where someone was building an ontology with UML. I'm not taking that crap. You cannot build an ontology in UML. If someone does that, and if someone accepted that to a scientific conference, they didn't know what they were doing. Nope. Yes. Yes. Yeah. So the answer to that is fairly simple. Oh, yes. So where is this stored? It's not a database. And do you have an endpoint from which you can access your data? And that, I think, is an excellent question that leads us far into building semantic web technology systems. It's also a really good question. First of all, the ontology itself, OWL, consists just of triples again. So it's more triple statements, yay. With a few more qualifiers like classes, for example. That's all you need. So the data, the triple data, you store into a type of data repository which we call a triple store. Triple stores are a special case of craft database. What you do with the ontology is you just take an ontology and load it into your triple store along with all of your other data. And this leads us to an important thing about semantic web technologies. In semantic web technologies, we don't have metadata. And actually, I would even say in the real world, we don't have metadata. Because your metadata is my data. Metadata is an artificial concept. It doesn't exist. And we don't need it to manage data. We just put all, I mean, in the semantic web world. In other worlds, we might need it. Gee, I need to be careful what I say. In the semantic web world, we don't need the metadata. We just hammer in our ontology with all our statements about our domain, and then we can use it. We can use the reasoning power that resides in the ontology and all of that good stuff. Well, see, this is not an out-of-the-box system. So there is an OWL API which you can use to address your OWL ontologies, and then you build your graphical user interface, or you use a store-bought triple store like Stardock or CraftDB, and then you can use their interfaces. Usually, they will have something like a SPARQL endpoint in which you can enter your queries. Of course, for clinical usage, what we try to do is we build graphical user interfaces that are useful for our colleagues, because we assume that people don't speak SPARQL and they are not able to write SPARQL queries. No, the OWL API is a standard. OWL is a standard. RDF is a standard. Those are all standards. It's not, I think we have a different meaning of the word standard. It's not a store-bought spot system. This is not like Microsoft. You take it out of the box and then it crashes. Yeah. Yes. Oh. Yeah. Honestly, the user interface for a clinician should always be different, probably. But yeah, as long as you use the same ontology, and that's the point. An ontology is a file that's like, I don't know, 130 kilobytes. It's really small. As long as you use that, all of your data will come together nicely, and you can use the same ontology in distributed areas. So this is also a really great technology to access data from different places. For example, in biobanks. I'll talk about that in a second. Okay, so don't fall for fakes. Ontology is sadly a little bit of a buzzword nowadays. So a lot of terminologies now call themselves ontologies. And the infamous I2B2 uses ontologies. They have an ontology cell. In the ontology cell, you load a taxonomy. And that taxonomy can be derived from a proper ontology, and then it's debatable whether you can use the semantic richness in the ontology, but it doesn't need to have an ontology backbone. So those are not ontologies in any meaningful sense. They're taxonomies. And taxonomies are fine for what they can do. Okay. So the language we write that in is OWL. That's also a W3C standard. It allows rich and complex knowledge representation. It is computational logic based, and it is computer parsable, which is really the big thing. Oh, UML. No, the thing with the AMIA conference, I was talking about UML. Yes, is XML based. Yeah, and actually, I mean, all of the ontologies I built, they use the RDF XML serialization. But I mean, which serialization you use is the same. XML is a basis of our. XML is still not a language to build ontologies. It's nevertheless a very useful language. But UML, Universal Modeling Language, to use that for building an ontology is just odd. I left after 5 minutes, so I wouldn't know. But it's probably published on the internet in a prominent place. I think he actually won the Best Paper Award. Okay, I think I was sneaky enough today. I try to be nice now. Oh, now we get to this chapter. I cannot be nice there. Okay, this chapter, and then I'll be a really nice guy. Logic. We all know the word, and the problem with logic is really that what logic really is has only a very vague semblance to what people believe it is. And I'm sorry for the dated examples. I picked those up when I was preparing a logic course, which will be taught next term. So, hey, if you want to learn more about logic, that's where you should be. Why are some Bernie supporters burnouts voting for Trump? What is their logic? So these people obviously use the term logic to mean, what are they thinking? Most thinking, in my experience, has nothing to do with logic. Okay. And this is another example from Twitter. I don't know whether you can read the statement, especially the people who are remote. I'm not sure. I'll read it out. May said, the priorities I have set, a more productive, skilled workforce, an economy balanced across the United Kingdom and open to new opportunities, can only be achieved if we listen to small businesses. I want those firms across all the sectors of our economy to be able to take advantage of the opportunities, yada, 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 yada. And the comment on Twitter was, not one part of this is logic. I don't know. Those are all statements. There's not a single inference. How would I know whether they are logical or not? They are all logical statements. I cannot say whether they're true or false. So what is logic? I really like the definition that a guy called Makinson gives. He says, logic is belief management. So in logic, we can do inferences. So for example, we can say that if there's smoke, there's fire, which is an inference. And then we say there's smoke, there must be fire. So that's inference. We justify statements based on other pre-existing statements. In English, you spot those things easily. It's like sentences starting with thus, therefore, and so on are usually inferences. Axiomatization, we already learned about that. That's a way to bring our knowledge together in a way that, for example, can be parsed by a computer. There are axiomatizations which are different, like just formulae, and you still need people to deal with them, but those are not of interest to computer science. And then you can do belief revision. And for that I have an example. So, Abbott, Babbitt, and Cabot are murder suspects. Abbott has an alibi based on a hotel register. Babbitt presents a witness that testifies he wasn't near the murder scene, and Cabot claims to have attended a public school event. We don't believe Cabot. Now, based on that, we think that Abbott didn't do it, Babbitt didn't do it, but we know that Abbott and Babbitt or Cabot did it. So then we find a video of the public school event, and then we learn that Cabot didn't do it. So potentially, statement C is wrong, right? Abbott has an alibi, Babbitt has an alibi, Cabot has an alibi, so maybe there's a fourth suspect that we didn't account for. or one of the alibis is faulty, which is usually what happens in a crime scene show. But so this is belief management, right? We look at what we hold to be true, and then we revise knowledge or what we believe to be knowledge. It's obvious that that kind of belief management would be hugely useful in computer systems. Okay, so why should you be interested in logic? I think that's more a question. If you saw how logic looked like, you would really be concerned that that might not be helpful. Logic is really something to learn about because it is the basis for the semantics of programming languages, all programming languages. It helps to create compilers. There is something, was that email? There is something like logical programming where people use logical formula as programs. An example of that is Prolog, which is used in Watson. It's not the only thing, actually. The thing that Watson does with Prolog is really a small thing, but it's a very important piece in the mosaic of how Watson achieves what it achieves. And then formal logic in knowledge representation, and this is what we're talking about today, is really a key strategy. So, for example, we needed to understand how ontologies work and how reasoners can deduce knowledge from ontologies and data. Let me see two more words about logic. There are truckloads of types of logic. Traditional logic is Aristotelian syllogistics. That's not even fully axiomatized. So there are no formula. There are formulated versions of it. Classical logic is two-valued sentence calculus. Scarcely use that. Predicate calculus, which is first-order logic, which we use a lot in programming. And then there are extended logics like modal logic, tense logic, many-valued logics, and inductive logics. The thing that we use in OWL is description logics. Description logic is a decidable subset of first-order logic. It does not allow reasoning about modalities. Modalities are things like possibly. So possibly I was in a hurry this morning. It also does not account for necessity. So necessarily, I can't think of a nice necessary statement right now. So necessarily all human children are mammals. Those things, if they use necessary and modal statements, don't work. And this is why it's really important to know logic, because it will prevent you from using the wrong kind of logic in your representations. This is an example from the NCI Thesaurus, and they have a statement: active peptic ulcer, disease may have finding some. No, I mean, you can put in may. This is for the computer. This is just a string, right? The computer does not read the may, and the computer doesn't think, haha, there's a may in that sentence. So there's a modality. The computer cannot do that. So what you should do is you need a modal logic to do stuff like that. Okay, now I stop being sneaky and I stop talking about arcane stuff. Questions so far? Okie dokie. Spatial silence. And this leads a little bit to the question of the universal hospital systems. In all fairness, the universal hospital systems aren't as great as they might sound, because only parts of those are really easily to integrate. Often, good, very good. So we have some learning going on here, not by me, but by the group. Great. Yes. So it's still within a unified hospital system. It can be tricky to trace steps, and I will give examples to trace things, and I'll give examples for that in a second. But then, more and more, we have to actually share data across sites. If you think about biobanking, biospecimens are a huge resource nowadays. They're really important, and actually, if you're clever, and UAMS is fairly clever with respect to that, you can make a truckload of money sending specimens to people who need them. So the pathology department is really excellent at that here. Sharing specimens. It's really an important thing, and it really helps medical research a great deal, because getting the right kind of specimen to do your research is relevant. Now, the problem is biobanks is a really cool example, because even at a university like UAMS, every person has their own biobank, because own is just a nice word. My own. Nothing feels better than my own car, my own house, my own horse, and my own biobank. Just how humans are. So, and all of the biobanks look completely different, because they all store the kind of data that they think is important for their research. Because it's their biobank anyway, there's no sense in thinking about how other people would like that data to look like. So even within one institution, when we look at biobanks, we often have silos. We have multiple biobanks, all using different systems, all using different models to store their data, and this is a huge problem. And even more, it's not only that we have spatial silos, we also have temporal silos. Think about legacy data. Think about the fact that a few years back here at the UAMS we used ICD-9 and now we use ICD-10. Think about a university that switched from RxNorm to NDFRT to represent drug information. So the question is really, how do we deal with our silos, both spatial and temporal? And don't be fooled, I said that before, silos are everywhere. They're also here at our institution. A really nice example of a biobank silo is this one here. And the paper, I'm a co-author on that paper, but the actual example is from the University of Pennsylvania, which, as we all agree, is not the worst place to do medical research in the world. They have two biobanks. One of the biobanks is really large, and they do two kinds of processing. They do the nested processing, and you can look up what that means on the internet. I honestly forgot. And they do the EDTA processing. So in their database, they have specimens which are nested plasma specimens which have gone through the nested process, and they have Buffy nested, which is Buffy specimens which have gone through the nested process. People who are already, who know me will know that I'm already now slightly annoyed because this is done differently. Here we have the method first in the nested plasma, and in the Buffy we have the method last. So it's not even consistently built, just the words. But it doesn't matter. And then we have the EDTA plasma and the Buffy EDTA. In the other biobank, they didn't do nested at all. They only did EDTA. So they named their specimens Plasma and Buffy. Now, for the people who were retrieving data, and that was a real-world problem, it was a nightmare finding all EDTA plasma specimens across the institution, because some of them just were not called EDTA. They were just Plasma or Buffy. And ontologies can really help with that, because in the end, in an ontology, the name is not important. You can just capture what process did you use to process the material, and if it was an EDTA process, it should come up whenever you search for EDTA specimens or EDTA processed specimens, and the same holds for the nested. So actually, they implemented an ontology-based biobank system in the University of Pennsylvania now, and they're very happy with it. Yeah. So wait, I think I have a slide with a nice book. Yes. So these things belong together, and in the ontology, it's fairly easy to just automatically create a group that contains all of these four. Oh, we don't need that. Okay, so the vision for biobanks is really that we want to use community-driven ontologies to provide a unified terminology to facilitate sharing data across different biobanks, both intra-institutional and inter-institutional. We also want this to help facilitating the integration with all electronic health record data and other clinical data with the specimen information. And we want to prevent temporal silos by allowing more flexible data management. One of the biggest advantages that I have not mentioned yet of the whole OWL thing, even though some of the questions clearly already led us in that way, is that it's schema-free. Database schemata are really weird. So full disclosure, I'm technically a philosopher. And I need to sit down for a second. So when I entered the data management world, I learned something really interesting about databases, and that is the way to build a database in order to get the best results when you query is to know exactly which kind of questions you want to answer using the data. That just completely crashed with something that I learned in philosophy, and that is that science itself is a question-generating process. And I found the last statement to be certainly true. In science, I don't know the research question I will raise tomorrow, because that question drops out of the result of my research today. And this is how research really works. It's not like, oh, we know already all of the questions that we ever want to ask. No, we don't know those. We will learn those questions as we progress in our science. It's a really important issue. So that means that whenever we arrive at our new questions, we need to build new database models. And those might be completely different from what we already have. So, and you can see a trend now, while not everyone is really super crazy about semantic web technologies, but schema-free data management has now a strong foothold in data management for the sciences, exactly for that reason. Schema-free data management means you're less confined by a schema that you developed when you were starting your research, and now you're like in your 5th year of funding. That's really an important aspect. And we could see that clearly when we had the data management for the National Children's Study, which no longer exists. But at that time, that was an observational longitudinal study, which is data management-wise a bit of a nightmare. But doing that in a schema-based fashion was that was terrible, because people came and wanted to change the schema like every week, twice. And then at some point we said, well, we just do away with the schema. We'll do it schema-free, and that was much nicer. Because in the ontology then, adding a new kind of entity, for example, saying, now I want to differentiate my patients not only in age brackets from 5 to 10 and 10 to 15, I want to differentiate them in age brackets from 5 to 7, from 8 to 10, from 11 to 12, from 13 to 15. That's easy. That's really very easy, and you can actually still reason across that with legacy data, but doing that in the data model is far trickier. I feel bad about asking you that, but could you? Thanks. Okay, so yeah, there are publications about all of the biobank stuff I talked about, and always, I mean, I really mean it. Feel free to ask questions. I have an open door policy, and you can always send me emails for those people who are remote and might not just enter my office. Okay, so yes, thanks. Yeah, that is the information. All of the ontologies I build, and that hosts for many ontologies, are open source. People can just use them. People can also change them and use them in their own project, as long as they give proper attribution. They are usually built by a whole community, because is that but true? I don't know anything. No, I don't know everything. So sometimes I need people to help me, and that's the way to build ontologies. You never build an ontology alone. I learn, that's the fun thing about ontologies, is I learn something new every day, because I work with people in biobanking, drug-drug interactions, trauma care, and they all teach me about their domain so that I can build the ontology. The only thing I can do is building the ontology in the beginning, and then you learn. It's really lots of fun. Okay. let's move on. Yeah, we already know that. So now you ask yourself, yeah, that sounds like a lot of technical overhead. And a lot of that logic stuff sounded really ghastly. I don't want to do that. And by the way, we have terminology. So why don't we just use our good old terminologies? They're pretty cool. And we know a lot of them, a lot about them. So the answer to that is fairly simple. Thanks. These are studies that admittedly are quite old, and they were done before SNOMED CT. SNOMED CT is a medical vocabulary. It's huge. It has everything. It has diagnosis, treatments, accidents. It has it all. It's a huge beast. When they did this research, it was not an ontology at all. Recently, they worked a lot to make it into a really neat ontology. They added logical axioms, and it's now in a much better shape than it ever was before. But in that time, it was a little weird. Now, they did two different studies. One was looking at the intercoder equivalences. So that means you have multiple people who code the same medical material. And then they also looked at the intracoder equivalence, which means you give the same material to the same person to code more than once. The equivalence was never better than 58%. Even, let me say that, for the intracoder things. That means one person coding the same thing only coded the things in the equivalent way 58% of all times. What this means is that 42% of your data might end up being irretrievable because you have no idea where it is. Or you need to search for it for weeks. That's not good. Honestly, it's not good. Okay, we'll move on. I think I made my point. So that shows that ontologies alone cannot ensure that, for example, terms are used consistently, that we always code the same things in the same way. Ontologies potentially, I'm not saying we have that in an out-of-the-box solution, but they could do that. Remember the categorization thing that we programmed in the beginning. Instead of having people sort stuff into 34 categories, now they only needed to answer 6 questions, and we did the sorting for them. So ontologies can exactly help with that problem. With the terminology, we have no computer-based way to validate whether the coding makes any sense. It's really like trust your coder. And I'm not, coders are good people. So they are people, so they make mistakes. And they pick different codes for the same thing, as we've seen. And of course, there are still a plethora of different terminologies and data elements and all that good stuff, and that in the long run hinders data integration. If you have data from the VA and data from UAMS and you want to look at drugs, have fun, because UAMS uses RxNorm, the VA uses RDFNT. Yes, that's really lots of work. Let's go on. Yeah, I'm sorry. I'm getting thanks. Oh yeah, I'm sorry. There's always you can read truckloads of stuff after this, and you can always also ask questions. But go on. Yeah, I'm standing up for that because this is so much fun. These are slides that I borrowed from a colleague from Children's Hospital of Colorado, and they were looking at core vital signs, and some people might know those already. Yes, exactly. So in the Children's Hospital in Colorado, they use 113 unique names for blood pressure. Isn't that great? So many. In all fairness, only 37 of those are actually in use. And only 29 have been used more than 1,000 times. Well, that makes things much better. This is exactly the situation that we all know. And it leads to this. These are the 29 things that are in use. Now imagine that what you want to know is the blood pressure of all patients seen at UAMS today. or at Children's Hospital. So now you need someone, and for example, at UAMS, we have these people in our data warehouse group. They know all of these 29 names. And then when you ask them, give me the blood pressure, they will do that job. And that's good. It's good that we have those people, but it's not only an efficiency issue also, and God forbid, but if those people, for example, took jobs elsewhere or were hit by a bus, we're in a pickle. And the question is really, why don't we tell the computer that all of those 29 things are about blood pressure? Because don't think about data for a second. Do me a favor. Let's think about the real world. Those things are really similar, right? They were taken in a fairly similar manner. Sometimes the patient was standing, sometimes the patient was lying down. It is about the same phenomenon. It just got so dissected and weird the moment we do data management on it. That's a shame, crying shame. And we need to do better than that. So this is really relevant work for loading EHR data into a data warehouse. I'm not saying we should lose all of that additional information that's in the name, like, for example, whether the patient was lying down or whether the patient was standing. We can retain that. And here is an example of how that would look. Here we see a simple example, and this is just a 5-minute representation, and not something that would deal with all our problems, but here we have a blood pressure measurement that has as an outcome the measurement datum. Those are the numbers that we are interested in. All of those are about a phenomenon in the human body that we call blood pressure. And then we can still say, when we look at the measurement, give me all of those measurements which were obtained while a patient was lying down. Give me all of those which were obtained while the patient was standing up. As long as we have the information whether the patient was lying down and standing, we're fine. But we can sort it in every which way we like. And this is really important. This is also a trend in data management. You might have heard the phrase, all models are wrong, but some are useful. Well, that's true. But the trend nowadays is don't model your data when you enter it into the system. Put it into your system unmodeled, schema-free, and then when you pull it, use a model to pull your data. Tell your computer, give me only the things about patients that were lying down. That's an easier way to do that. Questions, comments? Okay. Good. Now, hopefully, some of you now think that these ontologies are potentially useful. So you ask yourself, where do I get them? Do they sell them at Walmart? Nope, not to my knowledge. Those are two resources that you can use to look up ontologies that are relevant to the biomedical field. One is the NCBO bioportal. I start with that one. That's a national effort. It was funded very well once. It's huge. It has 250 ontologies. The problem is that they're all uncurated. So there are people, if you do a PhD project on an ontology, then you just upload it there. Those ontologies are not tested by usage. They don't necessarily have a huge user community that helps making the ontology better. So they are a little problematic. One example, and sadly I didn't bring that slide. One good thing is if you look up the term person on bioportal, you get 71 hits. So that means within the bioportal we have exactly the same problem that we have with blood pressure in our medical record system, right? Because those, you never should represent something that you already have. The Obo Foundry is an international group. I'm part of that, so I'm somewhat biased, and I will disclose that here. I don't get money from them. It's a collaborative, mostly scientific academic project. The Oboe Foundry has 10 member ontologies. The most well-known ontology in the Oboe Foundry is the gene ontology. Everyone who had worked with genes so far probably stumbled across it at least once. There is an effort that all of the ontologies are orthogonal so that they build on each other. That's an effort. It's not working 100% at this point. There was a paper about that by Dumonte and what's the other one? Robert Höndorf. So yes, interesting paper, but at least they try to be consistent with each other. They all, however, adhere to guidelines of good practice and how to develop an ontology, so you get some idea of how those ontologies are derived. So why are those resources, even the NCBO, important? Because the first rule of ontology development is do not develop an ontology. Don't. Because probably what you want to represent for your data already exists someplace, and reuse it. Remember unique identifiers, right? Don't create a situation where we have 115 blood pressure names. We don't need another class to represent persons. Nope, have it. Reuse it. And I'm not saying reuse entire ontologies. You can also just use bits and pieces of ontologies, specific classes that you need for your use case. When I say use case now, I specifically exclude the small test case that we'll build in the lab section. But if you get into developing an ontology seriously, rule number 1 is don't develop an ontology. Only if you really need to develop an ontology, you should develop it. Developing ontologies with all of the actions and stuff, that's grueling work to begin with. Okay, now we switch to something that has to do, so I think there is a good hiatus here, having more questions. This is the technical stuff. We're done with the technical stuff. Now I get to be philosophical. Okay. Keeping it real. So this is something that's really important. And I already said, let's not look at data for a moment. And this is where we're going now. So we're leave behind everything that you learned so far about data management and data representation. Forget about that. So this is a really famous picture. And the picture says, this is not a pipe. Most people think that's a joke. As an ontologist, I think it's not a joke. This is not a pipe. It's a picture of a pipe. And there are differences between pictures of pipes and pipes. So, for example, check the statements that you see on this slide. And in your mind, check which of those are true and which of those are not true. This is 34 kilobytes in size. Admittedly, you cannot know whether that's true or not, but could it be true? It is made of prior wood. You can put tobacco inside and can light it, and I downloaded it from the internet. So some of those are true for this thing, and some aren't, because this is not a pipe. It's only the representation of a pipe. And this is really important because when we represent our data, we often make the mistake of mixing up the representation of the data with what the data is about. This is an example of it. Our electronic medical record has a size which is, I don't know, 343 kilobytes. It has a part that's a document that is about 180 centimeters, and that's the height of the person that electronic medical record is about. So the electronic medical record does not have the height 180 centimeters. That's nonsense. Electronic medical records don't have height. Nope. And the electronic medical record also does not suffer from Crohn's disease. Trust me. It's fine. But these are things that lead to endless mistakes. We're basically continuously puzzling our computers because we mix up the representation of something with what the representation is about. And sometimes then we call the things that are about the representation metadata. Metadata. Yeah, I'm sorry. I'm on a metadata crusade this week. Okay. So what we want to do is we really want to look at the world as it really is. And I now use an ism, and I know isms are tricky, but there is a really neat paper by Barry Smith and Werner Kustis which said you don't need to be a realist at heart. You can stay a conceptualist or a gung-ho Foucaultian, do what you like. But when you build knowledge resources, this is a good methodology. So, first of all, the world exists independently from human minds. This is really important. Things outside of the world exist without us, and now, even more important, the world exists independently from human activity. If you look at the ICD, regardless of 10 or 9, if you look at SNOMED, you will find there, across the representation of diseases, stuff like, oh, this is lung cancer if you find it by doing this methodology. That's not a good category. It's good information to know how you found out your patient has lung cancer, but it's not a type of lung cancer. Because in 50 years, we find that out a different way. So everything that we put in now is just going to become false. So the natural phenomena of the world exist regardless of our activity. And the phenomena of the world are perceivable and measurable. There are people who believe otherwise. I don't know whether that's a problem we have here, but go to an ontology conference. Okay, so from this follows that we can make true assertions and statements about the world. The truth of a statement or an assertion depends on the state of the affair in the real world. If I'm 7'11" in height, depends on my height. But we cannot find out whether that's true by looking at data. It depends on something that exists in the real world. And it also means ontologies are scientific enterprises. Ontologies can be wrong. Sometimes we realize that an ontology just contains something that was not updated, the gene ontology, and then we need to update it. Okay, I need to speed up a little, so I'll skip one slide. So what we need to introduce is, well, what I want to introduce is the basic formal ontology. Basic formal ontology is a type of upper ontology. So when we want to build an ontology, sometimes it's useful to think about, so to speak, the nature of things. And that's very tricky, and I hate doing that. So there are people who love that kind of stuff. And they build upper ontologies. Upper ontologies do not contain anything that's immediately domain relevant. It doesn't have penicillin or Crohn's disease or omeprazole or anything that's really useful. It has stuff like, what is the universe made of? And there are multiple upper ontologies, and they are really useful because then if I build an ontology about money and you build an ontology about hospital procedures, and one day we want to bring those together because, heck, we want money for our hospital procedures, then it's easy when they use the same upper ontology. Yeah, BFO, there's a whole book about it. And that's based on a realist perspective. Other upper ontologies are Dolce and which one to name? Sumo, that was the one. Yeah. I think BFO at this point is a pretty solid guess if you want to do biomedical ontologies, because most of them nowadays use BFO. There's a small community still doing Dolce. So this is the taxonomy underlying the BFO, and it does have axioms and things. So this is just the taxonomy. And we will go through that really quickly because that's part of your lab. So the first distinction that BFO makes is the one between universals and instances. So we need to keep separate individual things like me, you, this chair, the United States, and things that are repeatable, human beings, chairs in general, nations. Yeah. So instances are individuals, universals are repeatables. Everything that we think about in biology and taxonomy are universals, right? If we say lions, cats, dogs, I don't know, creatures I think about. Okay, so as a rule of thumb, instances are things that we would find in an inventory. So when you do an inventory of your shop, you count all of the screws, and then you write, okay, I have 4 screws in there. If you do a catalog, it's mostly about the universals. If you have a catalog, for example, about technical equipment, they don't send you the thing that's in the catalog. They just send a thing of the same type. It's like desserts in a restaurant. They don't give you the weird thing on the tray. They bring you a fresh one from the kitchen. That's of the same type. Okay, in our classes usually represent either universals or collections of things, like all the people in this room, and individuals are represented by represent instances. Okay. Now, continuance and occurrence, that's tricky. Continuance are, you can read all that. But my rule of thumb of how to distinguish whether something is a continuant or an occurrent is, if you can take a photograph, it is a continuant. If you need a video, it's an occurrent. Can you take a photograph of this? The movement of my hand? Nope. You need a video because it's an occurrent. Can you take a photograph of me? Yes. Don't do it, but you can. So I'm a continuant. The waving of my hand is a occurrent. This workshop is a occurrent. Last night's Traveler's Game, there was no Traveler's Game last night, I know that, is an occurrent. This room is a continuant. A natrium chloride molecule is a continuant, and so on. So these are definitions. Continuants are entities that exist in full at any time at which they exist. They persist throughout time while maintaining their identity, and they don't have temporal parts. Occurrence are entities that have temporal parts, like the movement of my hand. This movement has a temporal part that is this, a temporal part that's this, and a temporal part that's this, and that's this. The people remotely could not see that, and I'm sorry for that. I was just waving my hand and showing how the waving of my hand has different parts which occur at different times during the waving process. Okay? Questions about continuance and occurrence? Okay, this is part of the lab, so if you have problems, send me emails. Dependence and independence. So we're talking here, this is ontology talk, we're talking about existential dependence, not about causal dependence. I'm dependent on my parents, right? If it weren't for my parents, I would not be here. But that's causal, that's not existential. Sadly, I wear a black suit today because my example is the color of my suit depends on my suit. If my suit did not exist, the color of my suit did not exist. My height depends on me. If I were not here, my height would not exist. I'm not saying there would not be other things that would be 5'11", right? But my height would not exist. Or my role as a lecturer today, and so on and so forth. Likewise, Oliver Twist. Oliver Twist also depends, the content of the book Oliver Twist depends on the existing of books, movies, video games. I don't know what else people would think up, but it depends on these entities in order to exist. Without those, the content of the book would not exist. Dependence, independence questions. Okie dokie. That's an easy one, material versus immaterial entities. Material entities are things that have some portion of matter as a part. A human being is a material entity, a photon, a puff of smoke, because the smoke contains material entities. And an aggregate of human beings, all of the people in the room, are a material entity. And the undetached arm of me is also a material entity. Immaterial entities are really simple. Don't mistake those for abstract entities. So immaterial means the inside of this room is an immaterial entity. The inside of my nose or my mouth is an immaterial entity. It has boundaries that are material, but itself is immaterial. The boundaries themselves are also immaterial. For example, the boundary of Wales. Very nice. The boundary of Wales. Questions? So I think that an arm would still be an arm if it's detached. It's then an undetached. It's then a detached arm. But my arm does not. So my arm is not defined by the fact that it's a part of my body, as is my liver is not defined by the fact that it's a part of my body. Absolutely. Yeah, I think there's no way you can transform a material entity into an immaterial entity. There is none. You can transform how the material entity looks like, right? You can burn my arm, and then you detach it because I have gangrene, and then you cremate it, and then you'll have some ashes. They are no longer my arm. They are transformed into the ashes of what formerly was known as my arm. Let's not talk about that. Gosh! Okay. Qualities versus realizable entities. Now we're talking about dependent entities. We already learned, Yes. That is a really good, that is actually a question of ontological debate. Is a famous clay figure or artifact in a museum, is that still basically a lump of clay? I think that's the similar question, and there are different ways to see it. Some people say it's one thing and it instantiates both a portion of clay and an artifact. Some say the artifact is basically the idea and it inheres in that portion of clay. There are multiple answers to that. Sadly, or I don't know, most of philosophy, everything except logic, is not a exact science. So there's always, usually it's safe to assume that as many if you have X philosophers, you have X plus one opinions on something. Okay, qualities and realizable entities. Qualities are things that just exist and the things have them, so to speak. I have the height 5'11", my coat has the color whatever it is, and so on. And I have a weight, which we are not discussing, and so on. But realizable entities are different. So I have the role of an educator. What I'm doing now here is realizing my role of an educator. While I always have the role of an educator, it's not really always manifest. I need to do something to manifest it. The same is with my role as husband. I bear that role at all times, but in order for that role to become manifest, I need to do stuff. Buy flowers on Sunday, or go to the museum with my wife, or something like that. Those are realizable entities. There are other realizable entities, for example, disposition. So glass has a disposition to break. If I had a piece of glass here, which I don't, and I would drop it to the floor, I cannot promise you that it would break, but there is a potential that it breaks. And it always has that, but this breakability of the glass only becomes manifest when it really breaks, when it really is dropped to the floor and breaks. Yeah. I think it's still a realizable entity because it needs the process of the break. I mean, then you are in the lucky position that you can define the circumstances under which that becomes manifest. No, I wouldn't. Class has the it's a word thing. I think we're talking about the same thing, but the ontologists say if it needs a process to actually happen, then it's realizable. If it's just there, my height, whether I'm standing here or lying in the coffin, my height is just there. I don't need to do anything to have my height. Or for my height to become manifest. That's the better. Okay? Good question. So, okay. We're nearly done. Thanks God. Role versus dispositions. That's an easy one. Typically, roles are things that we assign in a human process. So my educator role is something that people at UMS at some point thought that it would be neat to just push me in front of a crowd and have me talk for an hour. So versus dispositions really have to do with the physical structure of something. So I might have a disposition to get upper respiratory infections. That has to do with my physical makeup. If I lost that disposition, that meant that I would have physically changed. And no offense, but if UAMS kicked me out tomorrow, I would not physically change. I would still be fine, and I would say, yeah, I'm free. Kidding. Okay. Yeah, so dispositions have to do with the physical makeup. The class breaks if you drop it because of how it is physically built. Some patients become colon cancer patients because how their nature is. It's part of their organism that they have that predisposition. Okay. Processes are occurrence. We don't need to care about any other types of occurrence. We only talk about processes. When you go into your lab exercise now, I hope. Can you help me? Oh, maybe, I don't know how much of a mess I created.
Yeah, he's one of those in the tray.
Is this the one?
Just click on one of these. Nope, not that one.
That one?
Yep, not that one.
Okay. Okay.
Yeah, I find it.
Yes. So I start to talk about the lab exercise. In the lab exercise, you're asked to think about a domain. You can pick anything. I had Scotch whiskey ontologies built in classes. I had wardrobe ontologies, musical instruments, types of university courses. Pick a domain and provide a small ontological representation in writing. I don't want you to do anything without. That's just difficult. Huh? No, actually, OWL is, once you know it, it's great. But until you know it, you would need to take the tutorial, and then your 4 hours are gone. Yes? Yes. Okay. So I think you have those slides. Read them carefully. One point that I want to drive home. This is my fun. See, I don't want it to be biomedical. This is a heavy metal ontology. Far more fun. I'm just kidding. Biomedical is the most fun in the world. So I don't want you to build merely a taxonomy. So don't use only the is a relation. This is an example of only using is a relation, right? So we have heavy metal music, we have death metal, black metal, power metal, and they are all somehow related. I don't want that. I want you to build something that looks like this, where you say heavy metal music, well, black metal is a type of heavy metal music, and pagan metal is a type of black metal music. But pagan metal also uses acoustic instruments, and it's influenced by Celtic folk music. So what you need to do is use more than just the is a relation. That's the task. You can create those relations at will. And with respect to the domain, you already now see that it's important that you have some kind of knowledge about the domain. That's why I usually shy away from saying you do this domain, because I don't want you to spend time reading up stuff. And then I want you to sort these entities that you talk about into the abbreviated BFO that I provided here. So think about, what is Celtic folk music? Is that a continuant? Is it a realizable entity? And don't think about that because that's my domain. Think about your domain. Whatever you do, think about, are these entities, where do they fit here? The great thing about upper ontologies, it's like a set of drawers. You take the things in your domain and you put them there, and it already helps you a great deal. Okay, questions, concerns, free associations. And the slide deck with the thing has all of the definitions. And I assume you have access to the slides that I showed today, which hold additional definitions. And when in doubt, send me an email. And that's about it. Can I just hang up? Yes.